you something like you've never had before. Something richer, greater experience. Amen. It's hard to believe another year has just about passed. Amen. We'll be into the Christmas season here in a bit. And we're looking forward to that, and I know you are too. Amen. Psalm 27:14, I want to continue on the message that we began preaching last week. We talked last week about waiting on God. And today I want to talk to us a little bit about temptations that we find when we wait on God. You see, waiting on God brings an internal struggle inside of us. It brings us to a place, a mental challenge, a place where our mindset is oftentimes dark, and that darkness can drive away the very lightness of God, you know. So, as we read in 27th Psalm, verse 14, the psalmist says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, wait for the Lord." Amen. Would you pray with me? Father, we love you, we glorify your name, we magnify you for your majesty and strength. We praise you, God, that you never fail us, that you never leave us, you never forsake us, but that you walk with us every moment of our life. That all power in heaven and earth is in your hand, Lord. And as we go through seasons of our life, help us rejoice that we are not alone, that you know every need that we have. It's in your name we pray. And somebody said amen. I think after last week's sermon, we can all agree in theory that we should wait on God. But sometimes it's easier said than done. We don't like waiting. Waiting is hard for everyone. And Satan knows this, and he will use our frustration to tempt us. Here in the psalm that we read today, David is talking about waiting for the deliverance from his enemy. Can you give me just a minute? Amen. I'm so keyed up this morning, I don't know what I'm doing. Amen. Somebody say praise the Lord anyway. Amen. So David was in the midst of a situation where he's having to wait on the Lord. He's waiting for a deliverance from an enemy that was chasing him. And the only one that could deliver him was God. But David was tempted to take a shortcut. How many know that sometimes whenever we are in the midst of waiting, we are tempted to take a shortcut? Amen. 3 times David had an opportunity to kill the man who was persecuting him, the man who was seeking to take his life. And I'm sure he was tempted. In fact, if you know much about the story, he went as far as to cut the ends of Saul's robe off of him. We also are tempted to think our timing is better, to take shortcuts. We disrespect God by assuming that our limited viewpoint is greater than our Creator's. Shortcuts are not always what they seem to be. Our lives are full of the interpretations we get from our 5 senses, what we see and hear and feel and can touch. But you know, all of those things are limited within us because there's things you cannot see. There's things you cannot hear. There's things that you do not know because there is no way for them to enter into your mindset because you are limited. Jesus said this about taking shortcuts. The difference between taking shortcuts and listening to his word. He said, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams arose, the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall because its foundation was on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. Last Tuesday, Brother Lyle and I went to see Michael up at the hospital. And when we went to see him, we went into that parking garage. And, you know, there at Genesis East, it's got like 5 tiers. Anyway, we went up there, and I got to looking around because the only place we could find to park was on the very lowest tier. And I thought about those pillars that were holding up 4 other tiers of parking. And I thought, man, I hope the contractor that built this didn't build it with shortcuts, didn't take shortcuts. We've all seen in the news where a contractor took shortcuts, and in my mind, I go back into the late 1980s, maybe it was, where there was a whole motel that collapsed in Kansas City because of a contractor taking shortcuts. I don't know if you remember that, or even if you're that old, but anyway, I think about that, and I was thinking about that, how I hope that the contractor didn't take a shortcut. But you know, a lot of people, when they take shortcuts in their life, they don't understand the long consequences of that. And Jesus said, here's the long consequences. If you do what I tell you to, if you do things my way, if you follow my instructions emphatically, you're going to build something that will last. But if you take a shortcut, if you do things the way that you perceive, the way that you hear, the way that you see, the things that your senses tell you, if you walk according to your own understanding and try to take a way other than the way God has guided you, your whole building's going to collapse. Many Christians' lives have fallen apart because they thought there was some part of God's instructions that they could omit. That there was some part of God's instructions that they didn't have to take it to heart. They didn't have to receive its counsel. And so in that one area of their life, they just decided to do it I'm going to do it my way. And the end result is as Jesus predicted it would be, because those people have a life that's fallen apart, and sometimes they blame God, sometimes they blame others, but the reality is that they're taking a shortcut on the plan God has for their life because they're unwilling to wait for God's instructions. Somebody say amen. 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 Moving ahead of God, doing things our way. Jesus said, if you keep doing that, your life's going to fall apart. Sometimes we're tempted to take shortcuts. Sometimes we're tempted to get frustrated with God. When we wait for something we desire, we're tempted to think, if we don't receive it, that God really doesn't care for us. And even if we know that God loves us, we can question his goodness when our heart aches over something we can't understand. My mind goes back to the story of Jonah. And one of the things about Jonah is that he's like a lot of characters in the Bible. You know, we only point out the bad in Jonah, and we oftentimes say, well, I wouldn't be like that at all. How many of you have ever read about a character in the Bible and say, you know what, I wouldn't do that? I think about Peter and some of the things he did, and I say, you know, I wouldn't do that. But it's a funny thing. There's many times I've said I wouldn't do something, kind of like Peter did when he said he wouldn't deny Christ 3 times, and end up finding myself doing exactly. So Jonah was one of those type of people we like to compare ourselves better than. But he was just like us. And the Bible tells us that Jonah got frustrated with God. Now we know the story. Let's put it in context for a minute. Jonah was sent to preach to the Ninevites. Now if there was anybody in the world this man didn't want to preach to, it was to the Ninevites. He didn't like them, and he hoped God judged them. He was a little self-righteous, and it was with good cause. If you study Assyrian history, you'll know that this was a very violent nation, a very violent people, that they were some of the cruelest people ever